Good morning, Bimblers, and you join me here in not so sunny Warrington again, in my favourite little hidey hole on the banks of the River Mersey, just where the Wilson New Cut used to start, or end, depending on how you think about it. And the reason why we're starting our third Bimble in a row in Warrington is because on Saturday I had to abort the Bimble. We were supposed to go between Rochdale and Todmorden down the Rochdale Canal, but it rained and it was very windy and all the footage looked rubbish because there was rain all over the lens. So I made the executive decision to abort. So we're here in Warrington trying to get a quick little Bimble in so you don't miss me too much. So let's stop messing about and let's have another Warrington Bimble. Let's Bimble. This is Warrington Cemetery, and I'm stood in front of George Formby's grave. But the face on that grave isn't the George Formby you're thinking about. It isn't the When I'm Cleaning Windows George Formby. It's his father, George Formby Sr. George Formby Sr. was just as famous as George Formby Jr., but just in a different time in history. That was before the music hall stars started being in feature films on their own, so we don't really remember most of them. George Formby Sr. was born James Lawler Booth in 1875, and his mother was called Sarah Jane Booth, and she was 4 foot tall and a prostitute apparently. It's said that she was arrested 140 times, mostly for drunk and disorderly, but a few times for prostitution. And when she wasn't locked up, she used to sing in pubs for extra money, and that's where George Formby Sr. got the bug for entertaining. He was very neglected and very malnourished, and in later life he developed asthma and was very susceptible to bronchitis. But having seen his mother performing in all the pubs, he decided to work up an act himself, and he devised several characters which he used to do on stage. One of the characters was a clumsy little man in a suit that was too small for him, and he used to do tricks with a cane. And apparently he lent that little suit to another man, and his name was Charlie Chaplin. And apparently Charlie Chaplin took some of the tricks that George Formby Sr. used to do with his cane. George Formby Sr. became very popular in Lancashire, which all spread out to all around the UK. He even performed in front of George V at Knowsley Hall near Liverpool, but his ill health caught up with him, and in 1918 he caught the flu, in the big flu epidemic, and his health never really recovered. Apparently he used to have an oxygen tent backstage because he found it quite hard to breathe while he was performing. He died in 1921, aged 45, and he was buried here in Warrington where he lived. A few months after his death, his wife Eliza and his son George Jr. went down to London to take in some shows to try and cheer themselves up, and they went to see a man called Tommy Dixon, who'd basically stolen George Formby Sr.'s act, and he was actually billing himself as the new George Formby. And George Jr. decided that if anyone was going to take his dad's act, it was going to be him. And he worked up a stage act and went under the name George Hoy, because he didn't want to embarrass his father's name by being bottom of the bill. But once he'd found his feet, he changed his name to George Formby, and the rest is history. This isn't the only graveyard in this area. I think we should bimble to another one in a local church. Let's bimble.
Easiest to make. Aim for the stars, it's yours, just wait. You do your best along the way, but it's those arms that told me I don't care if it's yours.
This is St Elfin's Church, or as it's known in Warrington, Parish Church. And it's named after St Elfin, who was a follower of St Oswald, or King Oswald, the King of Northumbria, friend of the channel. Elfin and Oswald met in a place called Iona, which is up near Scotland, and historically it was a place known as Dalriata, and that was a region that took up part of the islands of Scotland and part of Northern Ireland. When Oswald became king, Elfin accompanied him down here to his kingdom of Makerfield. We spoke about that in the previous Bimble, our Carmill Dam Bimble. And King Oswald built a wooden church for Elfin on this site in 650 AD. And it was no doubt picked because it was in a perfect location, right by the River Mersey, overlooking Mercia. I'm unfortunately one of those pagan Mercians. I'd be looking over the river going, what are they building that for? Obviously that wooden church has been altered and added on to, and the oldest bits of the church that still remain are the chancel and the crypt, which were built in 1354. In 1648, Oliver Cromwell came round here, and he knackered up the church like he's knackered up all the other churches. In fact, Oliver Cromwell actually stayed round here during one of his battles. He stayed in a pub up there called the General Wolf Inn or as it would have been called at the time, the Spotted Leopard. It's since been knocked down. But we have a building in Warrington that was actually around at that time, and apparently Oliver Cromwell sat in there sending out dispatches telling people that he'd beat the Royalists. That particular inn is now called The Cottage, and it's an Indian restaurant. And I'm sure Oliver Cromwell would have loved a lovely lamb tikka boona and a pint of Cobra after Oliver Cromwell disappeared back down south. They smartened up the church again, and then they built this spire on the top, which is actually the 8th tallest spire in the UK. But Bimblers, we've been to a cemetery, we've been to a church with a graveyard. Why don't we bimble to a graveyard without a church? Let's bimble.
Without you, it's just a waste of time. You showed me from the start. Such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be ours. Big aspirations need a heart to hold you down. Though some get lost along the way, as sure as night designed the day, as long as I'm allowed to say, it's my heart that told me I don't care, you just disagree. Without you it wasn't meant to be. You showed me from the start. Such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be ours. Big aspirations need a heart to hold you. I don't care, you can say what you like. I'm a peace-loving person, but I know I'm right. It's as easy as right from wrong. I'm a lover, not a fighter, so
Where I'm stood now would have been St Paul's Church back in the 1980s. But apparently it was riddled with dry rot. So they knocked down the church and they built an old people's home on top of it, which is a little bit grim if you ask me. It's an old people's home that looks over onto a disused graveyard. And that's one thing you can't do with a graveyard. You can't knock it down and build something on top of it. That's all thanks to Section 3 of the Disused Burial Grounds Act of 1884. And that says you can't build anything on a graveyard unless it's spiritual. You can build another church or a little chapel, but you can't build a retirement home or a block of flats on it. But a graveyard without a church isn't really that rare, there's loads of them. The special thing about St Paul's Church and the Sunday school that was attached to it came in 1876. That was when Warrington Wolves Rugby Club was formed. In those days it was called Warrington Zingari Football Club. Zingari is Italian for gypsy, and a lot of rugby clubs from the time used to be called Zingari because they would wander about using everyone else's pitches. They didn't really have a home or a fixed place where they used to play. Back in my day, Warrington Wolves were called the Wire, but in 1996 they started something called the Super League, and all the teams had to change their name to more family-friendly names, more Americanised. So Warrington Wire became Warrington Wolves. That's apparently got something to do with the crest of Warrington having a wolf on it. Eventually Warrington Zingari Football Club did find a home over in Wilderspool at the Wilderspool Stadium, and then eventually at the Halliwell Jones Stadium, which is just a couple of 100 yards over there, you know, by the big Tesco's. But rugby wasn't the only sport played in Warrington, and it wasn't the only sport to be played in this locale. Let's bimble.
right from wrong. I'm a lover, not a fighter, so I wrote this song. You showed me from the start. Such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be ours. Big aspirations need a heart to hold you down. From the start, such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be ours. Big aspirations
This is Warrington Town Hall, or to give it its proper name, Bank Hall, and it sits in something called Bank Park. It was built in 1750 by a Thomas Patten, and he was the son of another Thomas Patten, who we spoke about before. He owned a copper smelting works at the banks of the River Mersey over in Banquet, and we spoke about that in my Mersey Cuts video, Banquet. Thomas Patten Sr. was the man that made the River Mersey navigable between Runcorn and Warrington. And after that he made it navigable between Warrington and Manchester, and he was actually on the board of the Mersey and Irwell Navigation Company. Thomas Patten Sr.'s copper works used to make those bracelets that were highly prized in West Africa, the Black Manillas. In fact, Warrington Town Hall, or Bank Hall, actually sits on top of giant blocks of copper slag. If you go into the basement of the town hall, you can see that the stones down there have a sort of greeny copper oxide colour. Bank Hall was passed down through the family up until 1870, when John Wilson-Patten sold it to Warrington Borough Council for £9,000, which in today's money would be about £800,000, which is an absolute bargain. You can't even buy a flat in London for that nowadays. He also sold all of the grounds around Bank Hall for a further £15,000, that's £1.2 million. And Warrington Borough Council made Bank Hall into the Town Hall and the gardens around it into Bank Park. In 1899, they installed the fabulous Golden Gates, and they were originally designed and made for Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was supposed to go and view them in 1862 at something called the International Exhibition in London. Her royal aides went on before her to check the lay of the land and see if there would be any problems on the horizon, and there was a problem on the horizon. The lovely Golden Gates that were built for her estate at Sandringham were stood next to a statue of Oliver Cromwell, and the royal family don't really like Oliver Cromwell. That was because he had Charles I killed. You know, not a family friend. Queen Victoria's royal aides saw the iceberg coming and decided to divert her away from the gates, so she never actually looked at the gates. In 1899, for some reason, the gates and the statue of Oliver Cromwell were put here in Warrington. I'm not really sure why, probably just because they were free, I don't know. When we were over at St Paul's Church, I mentioned that they played a sport here at Bank Hall, and that all happened before John Wilson-Patten sold it to Warrington Borough Council. In 1864, he let Lancashire Cricket Club play their first match as Lancashire Cricket Club here at Bank Park. Before they were Lancashire Cricket Club, they were Manchester Cricket Club, and after they played here at Bank Park, they started playing at Old Trafford in Salford, so it was a good job the name wasn't Manchester Cricket Club. They played Birkenhead Park here that day, and it was a draw. How's that?